The next thing we need to do is put up the markers. Most people are used to some sort of grid pattern, and we're doing the random markers. But we still have to place some of the markers in a grid pattern for one very important reason: that we need some absolute points for scale and survey. If you remember, a scale reference is two markers with a known distance between them. And if we have a recognizable shape every 1 or 2 meters, we'll have a scale reference in almost every shot. We'll do triangles, which are the best of the primary shapes, made out of 2 strips of tape so they never get too small and turn into dots. To measure out a grid, some people like laser levels, but we like a more old-school way of a microphone stand measured out to 1 meter by 1 meter, a meter yardstick, and a piece of string with a nut at the bottom for measuring the upper rows. Then we start in the corner and find the spot where the arm can exactly touch both walls. That gives us 3 reference points to start from, which we'll mark with a pencil. And then we just build out from there. To find the next horizontal mark, we use the yardstick to find the next floor point, and then the next wall point, and mark it. To find the upper rows, we hang the string, which has 2 black notches for a meter, and mark the upper point. For the floor, we start a long piece of string behind one of the meter marks, and line it up with the meter out at the other end. And then we make notches along the string every meter. And finally, we attach the triangles so they barely cover the pencil mark. It's important to pick one corner that represents the actual grid point so it ends up getting tracked. So here's our final grid. And let's turn up the contrast to see it better. And that brings us to the random shapes. When we say random, we really mean 3 shapes: angles, bars, and dots. On a small green screen, we can make them out of marker tape torn in half. On a large green screen, you might have to do full-width tape marks. Then we just make it an art project and put the markers all over the green screen at about 5 per square meter. And that's assuming a small green screen like ours. The goal is to be as random as possible. And if it looks like somebody threw confetti at the green screen, you've done it right. So here's our final green screen, which looks like a mess, but it's perfect for match moving. Some people think this is too many markers. But as soon as we get into close shots, it's not too many at all. And this gives you a real-world filmmaking freedom that you just don't get from the systematic grid setups, where the markers always seem to be in the wrong place. Still, if you're on a big green screen like the Laurel Canyon stage, or you don't have a single close shot, you can do half the markers and be fine. Remember that our markers are pretty dense because our stage is very small, and you have to scale it up for a bigger stage. At this point, you should get a scale reference, which is really important on a green screen. So roll 2 seconds of film describing the measurements, and which corner represents the grid point. Also measure the mic stands because sometimes they're the only reference in the shot. And make a unique mark on each stand so you can tell them apart. So let's do a test shot. This shot is nice and wide, so we can see tons of markers. We're shooting high speed, which doesn't really change anything for the match move. Then we use rough keyers and garbage mats to prevent her and the fan from getting tracked because the points have to be static. And then we match move it, which is literally a push-button match move. We use 2 triangles to set the scale so it'll fit right into 3D. Then we do a test render on a textured surface to check the floor registration. And what we're looking for is that there's absolutely no sliding of her feet. Some sliding can come from a bad match move, but some of it can also come from lens distortion, which we'll talk about in a minute. We're going to put her into an embassy scene, which is one of the scenes we'll work with in the next chapters. In Maya, we're free to position the match move to make the scene happen anywhere. We simply rotate and shift the entire camera move around to get the perfect framing. And if you're directing, you should make sure to be there when this is done for every single shot. It's usually good to overlay the green screen plate to see where she'll end up standing. And just like in a real shot, it's good to do some last-minute set dressing to maximize the sense of parallax and make the framing more interesting. So now we get extra sense of parallax from the column and the table. Then we do a low-quality test render. And the point of all these test renders is to catch problems with the match move before we commit lots of resources to the final renders. Because everything becomes irreversible right about now. Because then we render and composite the full quality version, which took several days to render because of the global illumination. The muzzle flares and the extra in the background are 2D footage placed in 3D space. Of course, the story in the shot doesn't make a lot of sense. But every virtual set shot goes through the same process. And it's very flexible in the beginning because we can place the shot anywhere we want. It's just important to understand that things get really locked as soon as we commit render time. And there's no going back unless you don't care what it costs. Previews are much cheaper, and the longer you can live with them, the more creative freedom you'll have. So this is a general purpose marker setup that will take care of all your wide shots. But it's important to be aware that some close shots will still not have enough markers. We have to spot those situations even if it's just part of a shot and put in some markers to beef up the match move. The magic number is again a minimum of 7 markers at different depths. And it only takes a second to realize it and fix it. It's also important that the points are absolutely static. Here, the post-it notes are flapping in the wind, so they have to be excluded from the tracking. With her also excluded, that leaves just a few markers to be tracked. We're still getting about 20 tracking points, but we're sneaking up on a failure. So it's always better to have too many markers, especially if they composite right out. So that's basically it. But there are a few important things we haven't dealt with. The first is that the moment we bring back the black cloth to cancel spill, almost the entire grid work disappears and there's nothing to track. But if you remember how much better the shot is with the spill cloth, you almost can't shoot without it with a good conscience. The solution is to make the cloth trackable by taping it up with white markers. They'll never get composited, so it doesn't matter what they look like. And as long as we can see part of the original grid, we have all the scale reference we need. So this match move is again push button, but it will key 100 times better. There's just one rule, that the cloth can't move, not even a millimeter, which invalidates all the points. So you have to weigh it down and not touch it during the shot. Also, keep a comfortable space around the actor so the cloth is never constraining. We're going so close over here that a shadow from the cloth ends up behind her. Secondly, there are specific things you can do to prepare for an emergency. First, you absolutely categorically have to get helper frames, which are the nice and wide still pictures from 5 or 10 angles. The animators can use them to survey the stage and save impossible match moves. So when your markers are stable, 5 or 10 pictures from different angles can save the day. And if the setup changes, like with the cloth, get 10 new pictures. Secondly, someone needs to shoot a distortion grid for every wide-angle lens. We're shooting with a pretty cheap one here, and we have to copy all this line bending for the plates to line up. Mismatches and distortion can again cause sliding, which gets worse the further we get away from the center of the lens. With the distortion grid, we can make an identical warp in the composite and use it to warp the 3D plate to match. There's a PDF on the website, but any grid will do. When you shoot it, make sure it's flat and full frame. Longer lenses don't usually need a distortion grid because even cheap lenses are pretty straight. Finally, there are sometimes shots that just don't work, mostly close shots. But there is a last-ditch option you should know about, which is to fake it. Basically, if you can't see the actor's feet on the floor, it's not that easy to see if the camera move really matches or not. We can exploit that by going into 3D and animating something that we think looks right. And with any luck, it won't be that bad. In the composite, the plates look totally out of sync because we're not matching the wobble in the pan tilt. But if we track a point on the actor, we can extract the wobble. And when we apply it to the background plate, it looks pretty plausible. This technique actually really works, but only on medium and close shots and people who don't move very much. Very lastly, remember that many shots don't need match moving at all. For lock shots, all you need is a single marker, or 2 if you want to Dutch tilt the camera. And then it's much easier to just forget about match moving and do them the old way. The only hard part is to match the camera height between the 2 plates. And it's not that easy to figure out if this is really the right height. So you again do the animators a huge favor if you measure the nodal height, which is the distance up to the middle of the lens. You should do this for any shot there's even a chance will have to be faked in post. Like the shot from before, or basically any close shot. So now we can finally get started working on a virtual set.